When I was a kid, we used to gather. We were one of those families, and I'm reminded of this. I'm just going to explicate this a little bit. When I went on our vacation trip involved going up to New York, my kids had been up there. We hadn't been up there in 10 years. And with all the kinds of the goings on, the loss that we experienced as a community beginning in the summer, I kind of felt compelled to take my family and go up to visit Grandma and to show my kids where I grew up and where I went to school, and go to the graveyard and visit where all the family is and hear some stories. And one of the things that I was reminded of, and we experienced while we were there, was the fellowship around the table. We would eat together. Growing up, we ate together at least one meal a day. Usually it was supper. We would gather in the kitchen around the very same kitchen table we were sitting around in our conversations, and we would have dinner together. And sometimes it would get pretty heated. My mom's food was always edible. And whether we thought so or not, it was. But a lot of times what was experienced around that one meal a day was life. And it was more than just eating the Brussels sprouts or the pizza or goulash. It was the conversation. It was the things we argued about. The things we couldn't quite make sense of. When my father would sit down and say, okay, it's come to my attention that there is a lamp broken in the basement. What happened? Life unfolded around that conversation. Along with some kicking and some food throwing and such occasionally. What I'm saying is, I was reminded of this even when we went up to visit and start sharing stories. What kind of stories would you share when you're with your family? When you're gathered with your extended family around the table? Today, what kind of stories would you share with your kids about growing up? What kind of things would you be willing to talk about? Chances are, it's the very things that at the time may have been horrible. But now you look back and you laugh at it and you're glad for those things. Our text today is about gathering around a table. It is. I could say a figurative table or a literal table. I'm going to refer specifically to this table. Every Sunday we gather in this room, and I am glad to say this. This isn't true of every church in every place. Every time we gather together in this room, God gathers us around this table to eat, to live. What happens in this room around this table has everything to do with this text. It has to do with life. It has to do with living. And what happens in this room around this table extends to every single table, figuratively and literally, that we gather around outside of this room. It happens around the pastor's office table when we have council meetings. It happens around the coffee table when people are sitting around drinking coffee together. It happens around this table when the celebration team comes in and rehearses. It happens around the figurative or literal table of the children's church right now. It happens around the table of the car when you leave this place and everyone packs into the car and you decide what's going to happen today. It happens every time you gather around your own tables at home. Sunday night, Monday morning, you're getting ready to go to work or go to school. Because you and I know that it's more than just eating that occurs around these tables. Jesus says in our text today, the bread that you eat, and that was referring to the Jews in the context, the bread that you eat is bread that will nourish you, but ultimately it is food that will, you're still going to die. You eat that food and you're going to die. The food I give you is different. The food that I give you, you will eat and you will live forever. You will have life with this food. So what is this food that Jesus offers us in this text today? What is going on around this table that brings life? Proverbs chapter 9, the last verse of our text today. Wisdom makes an invitation. Wisdom says, "Come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Lay aside immaturity and live, and walk in the way of insight." I'm going to clue you in on something here. He's not literally writing about real bread and real wine. So he must be talking about something else. He's talking about fellowship. Come and fellowship together. And through fellowship, much like eating around a kitchen table, you will receive nourishment. You will live. And you will gain insight. Wisdom has offered an invitation. Wisdom says growing, living, has to do with insight. It has to do with expanding your world. It has to do with expanding your relationships and even deepening your relationships. What does Jesus say to the devil when he's being tempted in the wilderness? He says, man lives on more than bread alone. He lives on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Jesus offers an invitation as well. And that invitation is the same invitation offered by wisdom. Because Jesus is the wisdom of God. Jesus is the insight into who God is. We can't get any more insight than Jesus offers. So Jesus makes an invitation. He says, to truly live, one must eat of my flesh and drink of my blood. The Jews get stirred up. When I say the Jews, it's the religious people. You see, they're gathered in a synagogue, just like they're gathered in church. And Jesus is there. He's the teaching rabbi at the time, and Jesus makes a proclamation. And as in any good church, there's a dispute. And they dispute over it. And in fact, the dispute is so passionate, it verges on violence. What's going on in this text is almost a near riot. But it's interesting, the dispute is not with Jesus. The dispute is amongst one another. Jesus and his disciples aren't implicated in this dispute at all. The religious people are arguing amongst themselves very passionately, vigorously, trying to understand what it is that Jesus is trying to say, trying to wrap their minds and their heads around something that seems totally outlandish. What does he mean? Eat his flesh and drink his blood. It's sort of like my family and I What do you mean by light? There are like 5 lights downstairs. This argument breaks out. Now you would think that Jesus would do something here. And he does. He agitates. They're disputing about what it is that Jesus is saying amongst themselves, and then Jesus responds by speaking plainly, speaking directly. He amps up the dispute. He says, my body is true bread. My blood is true wine. This is true. This is exactly what I mean. And he amps it up. Now, you and I can glean some real understanding from this text about what it means to be the community formed in faith, the church, gathered around this table, and in extension, gathered around every other table of ministry and need in this community. That is, that life comes out of exactly what Jesus is saying here. Dispute, arguments, disagreements. Not for the sake of splitting the community, but for the sake of insight. If Jesus doesn't agitate us, there's a problem. If his words don't challenge us around these various tables we gather, there's something wrong. Wisdom comes from such things. From the community gathered in Christ, community in which we abide together. We live together with Jesus, just like in this text. They're together with Jesus. The grace that we experience here is the fact that Jesus promises us insight. We will live. We will receive insight. Our world will expand. Our life will expand and become more abundant. We will come to understand the will of God more and more. That's right. There are 3 things I would like us to take with us as we come to this table, and then as we leave and go around our various tables throughout our life. Jesus promises us life and growth when we gather around this table as his people. First thing we're challenged to do is speak plainly. Speak plainly. When we are gathered around this table, when we are gathered around any other table in our life, we are to speak plainly. The reason I highlight that is because we are going into a political season where we're not going to hear a whole lot of plain speaking. You know, if a candidate were to speak plainly, really mean what they say, they'd be a target, wouldn't they? They would be held to account by their enemies, by their critics. And that's one thing that politicians in general don't do. But Jesus challenges us as Christians to speak plainly. For when we speak plainly, that is what begins the walk into insight. We cannot get insight if we can't be upfront with what we mean. The second thing is realize that when we speak plainly in community around we do so in the context of insight. We do so abiding in God. The third thing is, when we do question and we do maybe argue or disagree or try to talk this out or work this out, sometimes we get really passionate, is to remember that Jesus never leaves us. Jesus promises us his presence. He promises us insight. Just like in our text today, Jesus hears them disputing and he responds. He listens to them and he responds. He responds plainly and he clarifies what he's saying. The literal word used for eating in this text is gnawing, like an animal gnaws on a bone. Jesus says, gnaw. Gnaw on what you hear. Gnaw on what I'm saying. Don't just respond. Don't just blurt something out. Don't just walk away. Chew on it a bit. Chewing on it involves listening. It's hard to talk with your mouth full. So chew on it a bit before you respond. Wrestle with it. Pray about it. Paul addresses the same issue when he says, be careful how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise. What do wise people do? Wise people seek to understand what the will of God is. And while you're doing that, encompassing everything that I just said, speaking plainly, questioning and maybe arguing, and then clarifying and listening. While all that's going on, give thanks in your heart, in everything and for everything, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. We are gathered at this table every Sunday, at many tables of ministry and leadership and need. Insight is not easy to receive, not always easy to share either, but it's God's gift of grace to us. It is God's promise that when we are participating, when we are engaged, when we are open, when we are